Hey, it's John here. So I had an interesting conversation yesterday, and it was around ChatGPT. So we're going to do something a little different today. My background, I do have a systems engineering background, and I am director of emerging technology for a large IT firm. So we're going to talk about ChatGPT, right? It's sort of taken the world by storm, if you will, because it can fool people into thinking that they're talking with a human. It's also passed some university level exams, all sorts of stuff like that. So anyway, I tried the thing out just to see what it did, and I asked it, in fact, how it was trained, and it gave me an answer, surprisingly enough. And so it is basically, if what it told me was the truth, it's a machine learning tool. Um, they basically sent it out there to consume most of the internet in English and other multi languages, for instance. And what it's done, the secret sauce to this thing, is it's figured out how to parse natural language, which has been the holy grail of pattern matching in artificial intelligence for years. So when you think about natural languages, there's a lot of exception rules that we have that we just know because we're speakers of the language. But when a computer is trying to parse them using logic, it doesn't totally make sense because there's no way, for instance, that we can explain it. If you take, for instance, the I couldn't care less, or I could care less. If we were trying to parse those rules, they're very different. But to us who speak English, they mean the same thing. I don't give a shit, right? So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter which one we use. But if you parse it from the computer's perspective, I couldn't care less means that regardless of how much I care, I can't I can't reduce that any further than I have. Or I could care less basically says that it's possible, for instance, for me to actually care less. But for us, in colloquial terms, it's exactly the same thing. And what ChatGPT's done is it's managed to figure out those nuances, or at least figure them out. But basically, it has matched the patterns that allows it to reliably um, apply those rules. And that's a big deal in the idea of AI. But the really interesting thing, I think, and where it's going to be disruptive, is because, you know, because it can parse those types of rules. When we think of data versus information versus ideas, for instance, these are all sets of each other. So data are the discrete elements that we see, that we can sense, or that we create, or whatever. And they don't mean anything until they're aggregated into information. And then we can have these sort of bits and pieces of information, which we then aggregate into ideas. So for any given large data set, for example, we don't articulate all of the possible information, but these bots can, right? They can basically aggregate these things into information because they understand the rules of, or at least they can apply the rules of natural language. So they can then produce ideas, for instance, or information, as an example, um, that we can understand. And then that information can then be aggregated into ideas, which we do. And so when we take any large data set, we don't articulate all of the possible information that comes from it, and we don't even with the information we do produce, we don't produce all the possible ideas that are necessary. We only produce the ones that make sense at the time and that we need at the time. And what these things can do is they can do that. They can exhaustively do it. However, because it is a machine learning tool, and it's data driven, it can't create any new ideas. It appears to, because it creates ideas from the data set that we haven't thought about, or that we haven't articulated. So it looks like a new idea, but it's not, right? So it's very bounded by the data set. And the only way to increase the ideas, or the possible number of ideas, or possible amount of information, for instance, is to increase the data set. Other types of AI use inference engines, and they can create, because what they're doing is they're taking the data that they have, the source of truth, if you will, the information that they have and the ideas, and they're basically inferring um, things based on corollaries and stuff like that. Now, the probability of it being correct is actually lower than it is when it's data driven. And one of the problems with that is because then if the system takes that corollary, applies as if it was true, and then uses it to infer other information. So if it's already erroneous, for instance, then whatever it infers from that is also going to be erroneous, likely. And so it will get more and more disparaging away from the truth, right? And it will become more and more incorrect. So consequently, you have to apply probabilities that where they're pure inferences, for example, it has a lower probability of being correct than if it comes from the data directly. But nevertheless, these things can be extremely disruptive because what it does, where it can pattern match for these types of things, the possibility of automated production of software is actually possible. Because when we look at software production, I mean, it's normally based on single rules. A lot of modern computer programming languages are based on what's called Bacchus norm grammar. And they will produce a single consistent rule that's context free. And what that means is that if you write a statement in Java or JavaScript or Perl or whatever, when it translates to machine language so that the computer can execute it, it will always produce the same sequence of machine language instructions regardless of the context, right? So it doesn't have any ambiguous rules like natural language. It's very fixed. So where there is the possibility is that if something like ChatGPT can then basically translate our sort of ramblings, if you will, into data and then into information and then potentially into ideas. And then these ideas can then be translated, documented in a very concise way so that they can be translated through Bacchus forms, for example, into high level languages. It would be possible to produce software at the same time as we're thinking of the ideas, or at least articulating them. And so we could continually test and all that type of stuff. So I think that within the next 5 to 7 years, we're going to see a major takeoff because of what ChatGPT has done. And I think it will evolve, for instance, where we will see not only the machine learning from data sets and things like that, but potentially to see the inferences that go along with it. The other part of modeling human thought, for instance, and cognition is because we do heuristics. We don't have to have a complete information set, for instance, before we make decisions. So we make decisions on less than ideal information. So consequently, that's why we sometimes get it wrong, right? We're actually pretty good at the logic, but if we don't have a complete data set, for example, it's quite possible we're going to get the wrong inference. And so consequently, but those heuristics mean that we don't have to, we don't have the brain capacity, for instance, to store all of the information that we would need to make reliable decisions that are 100% accurate. We just don't. So we take shortcuts, and those shortcuts are called heuristics. And building heuristics into a computer system has been challenging. However, where they have managed to be able to match patterns, for example, that can do the rules of natural language processing, gives them that opportunity. So there is a possibility now that we can model heuristics and possibly get an actual thinking machine within the next 10 to 20 years. So stay tuned, folks. This is a really big deal. I think ChatGPT is something we all should pay attention to because it can have two major benefits and it can have two major problems. The major benefits is because where it is data driven, even if you're in a profession, say a software architect or a systems engineer or a scientist or whatever, you can't think of all the possibilities. So like, for instance, my background is systems engineering. If I think about any problem that I'm trying to solve, I don't know every single tool that's out there, right? I don't know what they all do. So I usually have to go out and research it. What ChatGPT can do is it can identify all the things that are supposed to be there, which allow me to go research, for instance, to see which ones will fit within the environment that I'm trying to design for. So that's cool. And the other way is of course it can then articulate all the different things. So it can actually save me a whole lot of time by sort of documenting what these tools actually do. And and then I can go verify that, for instance, and pare it back and then put together a good solution, for instance. So there's still the human part of it, which is the system engineering, but basically ChatGPT becomes a tool. The detraction of it is because it can go do this, it allows you not to think. So it's quite possible that you could put out a solution that looks kind of good, but it's actually low quality because there's no real thought that's gone into it. We just basically regurgitated a bunch of data that ChatGPT came up with. And because it can fool people like that, there is a good possibility that people will move ahead for instance, because of their expertise in ChatGPT and not necessarily in the domain that they're going in. And so it becomes more and more difficult to verify that people are experts within their field. And so those are the challenges around ChatGPT. But either way, you know, um, it's pretty disruptive technology. And I think perhaps we all got to, we've got to look at it. AI is going to become a big deal. And there are, of course, a lot of people out there who think that it's a horrible idea to come up with a thinking machine. And there are others who look at how it can enhance your life. And it, there's both, right? Because in a world where privacy is more and more difficult to protect, and where criminals, for instance, take advantage of our lack of privacy or our own stupidity, for instance, in putting information out there, um, that can be a huge challenge because what it can do is it can link together all types of information that would be ordinarily fairly difficult for people to find. So it can enhance the ability of criminals to target us, but at the same time, it can provide us with a lot of protection because it can also do that to the bad guys, right? So it can follow them around and figure out where they are and what they've done and all that type of stuff. So before they get an opportunity to hurt us, or after they have hurt us to face justice, these things, these pattern matchers, can really help out in terms of that type of stuff. So there's a two-edged sword to all of these things. But that's my opinion. I think we have to watch this stuff because I think it's going to be interesting in the next few years. Anyway, John out.